Very good morning to you. We know that Shaun Abrahams squaring off with his predecessor, Nkosazana. That's going to happen in the Constitutional Court. What is the gist of this fight?
Well, essentially, Nkosazana is abiding by the decision of the court, but he's saying the court should have heard his evidence, which it refused to admit his affidavit, detailing his interactions with then President Jacob Zuma over his removal from office, because the court said it was simply too late and he hadn't adequately explained why it was too late. But he's saying if this court should consider his evidence about his removal, which he very much ties to the former president's apparent belief that he, Nkosazana, was about to charge him for corruption. Now, the corruption case against former President Jacob Zuma, Uveka, is at the heart of this case. And of course, CASAC getting an undertaking from the NPA about that 2-week notice period about announcing Shaun Abrahams' decision has massive implications for when South Africa will finally know what the fate of the president actually is. And that's one of the key issues that has to be decided by this court. If CASAC is correct in its contention that Shaun Abrahams is simply not the right person to be making this historic decision, it could be months, before South before a new appointed person, if that High Court ruling is upheld, is appointed, and they make that decision, and finally we have some sense of what will happen to the former president.
I mean, just give us some idea, Karyn, as to, how compromised Shaun Abrahams is in this case. There's been lots of controversy around him. He says, he's never favored President Jacob Zuma, but his actions have always shown otherwise.
Well, the North Gauteng High Court essentially made this finding. It said, look, you have taken the president's side in a number of matters, including the Nkosazana case and the spy tapes litigation. There was very much a suggestion, not fully articulated by the court, that essentially President Jacob Zuma had put Shaun Abrahams in office in the belief that he would protect him, and that Shaun Abrahams was somehow implicit in this relationship. Now, Shaun Abrahams has said this is simply not fair. He's attached his documentation, letters that he sent to Michael Hulley, in which he gave certain timelines by which the president would have to make representations. He reached out to the Hawks, asked for the former investigating officer in the Zuma matter to be put back on the case, asked the Hawks to track down the 218 witnesses in this case, and did not acquiesce to Michael Hulley's request for Jacob Zuma to only make representations about the case against him in mid-February. So he's saying, listen, it's simply not fair to say that I took the president's side. And he's also arguing, Uveka, that, in the spy tapes litigation, it was him who established that, in fact, the NPA had relied on the wrong section of the Constitution in justifying the decision to drop the Zuma prosecution, and made those concessions in the SCA that ultimately led to the president also agreeing that in fact that decision was irrational. So he's very much on a fight to prove that he isn't compromised. However, I think, and it hasn't really come up in this case, the cases that have come up against him really in this matter concern his conduct with regard to allegedly failing to take action against Nonkobo Jiba, being very sarcastic and rude about the litigation brought by CASAC and Freedom Under Law. He says he was entitled to use the language he did in dismissing their application the way he did, which of course ultimately was successful. But also in terms of the public discourse, the sword that continues to hang over the NDPP, Shaun Abrahams, of course, was his decision, was his leadership of the NPA at the time that the decision to prosecute Pravin Gordhan, then finance minister, was made. His vociferous claims that the days of disrespecting the NPA were over, and then of course that 2 weeks later coming to the South African public and revealing that in fact the NPA, he as the NDPP had reviewed the decision to prosecute and decided that it wasn't tenable to do so, and that I think is the proverbial chain that he carries around his neck in terms of public perception of his independence.
Now, CASAC saying, Karyn, that this decision about the prosecution of President Jacob Zuma should be done or taken by the National Director of Public Prosecutions that the people of South Africa have confidence in. Is Mxolisi Nkosana that person? And depending on what happens here with Shaun Abrahams, if the court says, sorry, Mr. Abrahams, that decision is right, we're upholding that, would it automatically be Mxolisi Nkosana, or is there an option for there to be a total third party brought in as the National Director of Public Prosecutions?
Remember the North Gauteng High Court said that Mxolisi Nkosana had been reckless in concluding that 17 million rand golden handshake deal with President Zuma, that he must have been aware that it was not legally tenable and that it would not be just and equitable for him to be returned to his position. You know, if that decision by the North Gauteng High Court is upheld and you know, Shaun Abrahams is unsuccessful in his bid to challenge it, then the original order stands. And of course now the President, Cyril Ramaphosa, who is not conflicted as former President Jacob Zuma was, he is not facing any form of prosecution at this time in any way, he can then go through the processes of choosing and appointing a suitable person for that office. I mean, there has been a great deal of public discourse about who that person would be. Chuli Madansela's name has come up. She has told me she does not believe she is the right person for that job. But I think it will be a very interesting and important decision that Cyril Ramaphosa will have to make if indeed Shaun Abrahams is unsuccessful in this appeal, because the National Prosecuting Authority, since Vusi Pikoli's removal, has been shrouded in a sense of, you know, like questionable leadership, people being removed from office in highly problematic ways, not a single NDPP finishing their term, serious allegations against a number of these individuals who ultimately have to lead the prosecuting authority. And in a country which is gripped by, you know, the allegations of serious corruption, particularly in the public and corporate sectors, it is absolutely important that the NPA is led by a person that South Africans have faith in. That may be Shaun Abrahams if this court decides so, and that may be someone else. But ultimately, I think Cyril Ramaphosa and his team will have to think long and hard if that responsibility is that on their shoulders, that they will have to choose someone who, for the first time in the history of democratic South Africa, actually serves his or her full term.
Let's cross our fingers. Thanks very much. EANCA's Karyn just bringing us up to speed ahead of that Constitutional Court battle this morning.